Hi, boys and girls. I'm glad you're back. Today we're going to finish the story of the Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. We started it last time. What do you remember about the story? Good, you remember some things. Do you remember why the fairies were invited to the castle at the very beginning of the story? That's right, to celebrate the christening of the new princess. Why was the old fairy angry? You're right, she didn't get invited, did she? She didn't get invited because she had made her home in a tall tower. Nobody knew where she was. They thought she might be dead, right? And do you remember that the old fairy gave the gift of pricking her finger and dying to the princess? Yeah, and the young fairy changed that gift. And what did she do? What did she say? She wouldn't prick her finger and die, but she would fall fast asleep. For how long? Do you remember? That's right, 100 years. Good. And so, what happened to the princess? She did. She pricked her finger and she didn't die, but she fell fast asleep, didn't she? And how long will they stay asleep? Yeah, the princess will be asleep for 100 years. Who came and put everybody else to sleep? Do you remember? The same fairy that changed the gift for the princess, right? She didn't want the princess to wake up and not have anybody there because everybody she knew and loved would be dead after 100 years. That's a long time. Okay, you remember a lot. Great. Who is supposed to come to the castle while she's sleeping? Do you remember? Yes, a king's son. And who would a king's son be? A prince. Good. Okay, we're going to start off in our fairy tale book on page 17 right here. Can you see the picture of the prince? That's where we're going to start. At the end of 100 years, the son of a king who lived nearby went hunting in the countryside. He asked the people about the turrets he saw in the woods and why the hedge grew there so thickly. Each told him a different story. Some said it was a place full of ghosts. Others said the witches went there to hold their Sabbath meetings. Still others said it was the home of an ogre who caught children and ate them alive. The prince didn't know what to believe. Then a very old man said to him, "Please, your highness, more than 50 years passed. I heard my father say there was, at one time in this castle, a princess." Turn the page. "The most beautiful ever seen. Because she was bewitched, she must sleep for 100 years and could be awakened by only a prince." Never had the king's son heard of such a marvelous adventure. Fired by love and the desire for glory, he resolved at once to gain entry to the palace. That means to find his way into the palace. He prepared to cut down the hedge with his sword, but as soon as he came there, all the great trees, the bushes, and the brambles parted to let him pass through. He came out upon a broad avenue, and at the end of it was the palace. But when he looked behind to see if his servants were still with him, he discovered that the hedge had closed again, and he was all alone. However, this did not deter him, it didn't slow him down, for he was a young prince in search of love and glory. Quickly he walked into the palace courtyard, but what he saw made him stop in amazement. What do you think he saw? Do you think he saw everybody sleeping? Let's find out. A frightful silence hung over the place, and the image of death was everywhere. He thought that everyone was dead. A score of men were outstretched upon the paving stones, their limbs at grotesque angles. But then the prince saw beside the porter's goblet still filled with wine. He leaned down next to them and felt the movement of their chests, and then he knew that they were alive and they had fallen asleep while drinking their wine. Next, he crossed a court paved with marble and came into a guard room. Guards were standing in their ranks with their muskets on their shoulders, those are guns, muskets are guns, and snoring with all their might. He went upstairs and through several rooms filled with people, men and women both. Some were standing and others were sitting, but all were sleeping soundly. Finally, he entered a gilded chamber where he saw upon a bed embroidered with gold and silver a girl of 15 or 16 years. Her coral lips were parted slightly, and her beauty was so luminous that she seemed almost to shine. The prince approached her trembling and fell upon his knees. You see the picture there? Okay. Time to turn the page. Then, as the end of the enchantment had come, the princess awoke. She gazed at the king's son tenderly as if she already knew him. "Is it you, my prince?" she said at last. "You have waited a long time." The prince was thrilled by her words and told her that he loved her better than he did himself. They spoke for many hours, and though their conversation made little sense, it hardly mattered. The princess laughed merrily and nodded at the prince's remarks. It was almost as if she had imagined the moment of her awakening many times over and knew just what he would say. Perhaps the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very pleasant dreams. In the meantime, all the palace had woken with the princess. They were naturally concerned with their own needs, and since they were not in love, they were ready to keel over with hunger. The lady of honor at last lost patience and told the princess that dinner must be served. At this, the prince helped her up from the bed. Her clothing was magnificent, but he took care not to tell her that she was dressed like his grandmother. They went together into the great mirrored hall, where they ate their meal to the old-fashioned melodies of violins and oboes that had been silent for 100 years. After supper, the chaplain married them in the palace chapel without losing any time. That night they slept little, as the princess was so well rested, and they still had much to say. And in the morning, as dawn was breaking, they traveled to the prince's city, where his parents eagerly awaited them. That's the end of the story, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. Why do you think, why had the fairies been invited to the castle? Oh, we talked about that at the beginning, but why do you think at the end of the story he didn't want to tell the princess, but he thought she was dressed like his grandmother? Because she'd been asleep for 100 years, right? So her clothes were really 100 years old. Even though they were beautiful, they were kind of old-fashioned, right? Right. Is this a story that could really happen? Probably not. That's why we call it a fairy tale, right? Was the princess happy to see the prince when she woke from sleeping? She was. Can you name any other fairy tales with happy endings? Like this one? We've read some, haven't we? Yeah. Remember, Mrs. Keeler's favorite is The Frog Prince. I love that one. It has a happy ending as well. We've read several. Well, thanks for joining me today. That's the end of Sleeping Beauty. I think we'll have one more lesson on Sleeping Beauty the next time you come. So I'll see you next time.